By now, you guys are probably sick of hearing the word inflation. Canadians have been impacted by rising costs due to inflation, increasing costs for food, housing, and especially here in BC where I'm located, increasing gas prices. Over the past year, we have been in this cycle that seems like a never-ending change in prices. Things have been getting so expensive that it seems like it's never going to end. And a lot of us have been trying to adjust our budgets accordingly, or have just been keeping up with the same types of expenses with not actually realizing the implications of that. In this video, we're going to talk about inflation, the root cause of inflation, and a couple of ways to combat inflation. So first, let's talk about inflation as a whole. Essentially, it's just the rate of increasing prices over a specific period of time. When prices go up, your money that you have in your hand can't afford or can't pay for as much as it did prior. This loss of purchasing power hurts everyone's standards of living as a whole and ultimately affects those spending habits and changes how you kind of spend your money. High inflation, like we've seen over the past year, is unpredictable and unstable. This makes life especially hard for those who do not have an income that increases over the years, that doesn't keep up to inflation. Each month, the Bank of Canada releases a report that indicates the inflation rate for that year. Now, we're not going to go too into depth on what they actually release. We're going to do a separate video on that and actually break down the report and what it entails. But it's a good idea to take note that these reports are what we call lagging indicators. This is because by the time that reports come out, it's already a month behind, and we've already seen that effect in price take place. We've either seen a direct impact through food costs, through gas. Those are typically the two types of inflationary expenses that we see increase, and we've already seen that. So this report does mean something, but it doesn't really impact us directly. Next, we're going to talk about the Consumer Price Index, or CPI. And this is the core measurement that a lot of people use to indicate the rate of inflation. It's fairly simple. It tracks a certain amount, or the most common amount, of products and services and basket it into one bundle, and then says, okay, what's the increase in inflation over a specific period of time? Without going too much into depth, there's also many other metrics that some economists use, that others like to use to look at inflation rates to indicate, okay, what is the increase coming from? What sectors is it really coming from? So some people use core inflation, which excludes pricing increases of food and gas, or they might use the Producer Price Index, or PPI for short. Before we go any further, we're going to talk about a common misperception that we consistently see people talk about. And that is, inflation data is reported each month for the month prior, and it only takes into account one full year from that month. So it's not that month that inflation has increased 4.4%, for example. It's that month for that full year. For example, when the report comes out for July 2023, it's looking at July 2023 all the way to July 2022 and taking in that year of an annual rate increase for prices. Now, a common question, or a question that you guys might have, is how does inflation actually happen? And believe it or not, a slow increase in inflation is actually good for the economy. Low, stable increases in inflation is good for our money, being able to budget, to use our finances accordingly, to be able to adjust to our plan and to save so that we have some sort of predictable cash flow. It also means that our economy is doing well, it's growing, which is a good indication of the repercussions of inflation overall. This is why the Bank of Canada likes to keep a target rate around 2%. This means that the demand is there and that the economy is growing overall. We're going to look at 5 different factors that kind of impact or cause inflation and why it actually happens. Number 1, the first is going to be an increase in demand. When the demand for a good or services increases greater than the actual supply, then the price of the product or service will increase. This can happen when there's strong consumer spending. For example, we saw a couple years ago that everyone was rushing to the store to grab toilet paper, for example. I mean, the prices of toilet paper itself didn't increase, but hypothetically, using this scenario, it could have. Now, another scenario could be, in BC, we've had some bad heat waves. The demand for air conditioning has increased dramatically, and the supply is relatively low. So the price of an actual air conditioning unit has increased, and you can even see people selling them secondhand for more than they actually purchased them for. because of that high demand. The second reason inflation might happen is the increase in production cost. So when a production or a cost of supply increases, a business will typically move that cost to the customer, which overall increases the price of products. Some factors might be an increase in wages. So overall wages will increase the cost to make a product, which will then be pushed on to the consumer. It could be taxes that are increased, or it could be overall the raw material could increase, which will then be pushed on to the consumer, which will increase prices overall. Number 3, from a high level, we're going to talk about monetary policy. The Bank of Canada typically has 2 main levers that they use within monetary policy. The first being interest rates, which we have seen dramatically over a period of time, especially in Canada, and you see in the US as well. And then also money supply. So when money supply increases, when the economy is injected with more money, there's going to be more growth, which in result is going to cause more inflation. Now there's many ways that the Bank of Canada can inject money into the economy, but we're not going to go too deep into that. We're just going to say that that's one lever that they used, and it overall will increase prices and increase inflation. The second lever is through interest rates, and we've seen this already as interest rates were super low during COVID, and they've been increasing significantly to help kind of impact the high inflationary costs that we've had. We can see interest rates increase, and that is to help promote or to help reduce consumer spending. The whole idea is that your debts are going to have a higher rate, you're going to have to pay more interest on that debt, which will hinder spending, which will slow down the economy, which overall will hopefully slow down inflation. Now, the fourth reason inflation may happen is expectations and psychology. Inflation can almost be a self-fulfilling prophecy. If people are thinking that prices are increasing, then it's almost a pre-indicator for what's going to happen. And this is mostly because they will start to adjust their behavior accordingly, therefore it's going to happen eventually, and then it does. A fairly simple example is the anticipation that inflation is coming. A lot of workers will start to demand an increase in wages, which will overall be pushed onto the consumer, which will cause inflation. And the fifth and final reason inflation may occur is external factors. And these are things that are not necessarily in our control. An example of this might be the change of an exchange rate. For the price of a certain good or service, the Canadian dollar may increase or decrease based on the value of another currency. If the value of a dollar depreciates over another currency, then it's going to be more expensive for a Canadian consumer to purchase that good, which then means that it's going to be inflated overall. Overall, inflation is a fairly complex tool, and as you can see, it's not easily managed. It's very hard to navigate inflation and the increasing inflation, as we can see. But what are some ways that we can actually combat inflation today and help project into the future? One easy way that can help protect against this is budgeting and having some sort of financial plan. Making sure you know the ins and outs of your income and expenses can really be beneficial during these times of increased costs. You're going to be able to control your spending a bit better. There's some things like fixed costs, maybe your housing, and some other utilities that you're not able to necessarily change, but there's a lot of variable costs in your life that you're able to control throughout these periods. This might be things such as eating out, going on vacations, spending money on luxury items that you might not actually need, especially when prices are increasing and your budget is tight. And this kind of goes into my second point, is being able to adapt your lifestyle to different periods of inflation. When costs are increasing so dramatically, it might not make sense to be eating out as much. I went to a restaurant the other day and holy crow, the increase in prices over the past year have been dramatic. You can see that a meal might have cost for 2 people $60 Canadian is now 100 plus Canadian, just due to the increased cost of food in general. Or maybe it's just driving less. I mean, here in BC, gas is expensive, and even in other provinces it's still more expensive than the norm, but finding alternative ways to commute. Maybe that is through biking or purchasing electric vehicle. I personally purchased a plug-in hybrid to help offset the increasing gas costs, and I ran the calculation. It made sense for me to take out a partial loan on this car to help have some gas savings, and overall now I'm just pocketing the money I'm saving from not paying gas. So from right there, our gas bill stopped from $400 a month and dropped all the way down to $50 a month. And that's one way I have been able to help combat the inflationary costs and help to save a bit more overall. The third way to combat inflation is to create the budget, but be able to save each month and be able to have those savings and invest those dollars. If you're able to save and tuck away money and invest it in a way that will outpace or increase more than inflation, you're going to be better off ahead, and the money that you have today is going to keep up with the purchasing power that inflation is eroding. There are also many asset classes that you can invest in that will help actually increase with inflation. Making sure that you're able to find those asset classes and be diversified across it, because you don't want all your eggs in one basket and then to have something happen and there is your retirement savings or there's your down payment and it's all down. Making sure to diversify, but making sure that you're also protected from inflation and hedging that risk. And then another thing to note is reviewing your debts and interest rates. Inflation overall erodes purchasing power. So it's not good for when you're making money, but if you have debt, that value, the real value of that debt is actually decreasing. So a $100,000 debt today is going to be a lot different than 10 years from now. It's decreasing in value over time. Now, this isn't to say that you should hold on to a tremendous amount of debt, but it is something to maybe take a positive out of, but reviewing the interest rate on your debt is important. Because inflation and interest rates are positively correlated, they typically increase during the same period of time. It may be a good idea, if you expect there's going to be higher inflation, to lock in at a lower rate. I know a lot of people during the pandemic we saw super low rates, they locked in at a really low rate, and now they're very thankful because they're not worrying about these increased interest costs. In the end, we've seen inflation like this historically. If you look back in the 70s, for about a 10-year period, we saw an average annual inflation of 8% per year. So it has happened before, not saying that this is anything like this, but high inflation does come. It's something to go through. People in the 70s still came out of it okay. Actually, a ton of the wealth that was created during that time has transcended into what is now. So it can be a good thing overall, but it is something that is going to be happening no matter what. Inflation is not going anywhere. The main thing to remember is the target rate for the Bank of Canada is at 2%. They have a band of about 1 to 3% that they're trying to aim for. And right now, you can see they're slowly getting closer to that band. It just takes time for that overall effect to happen. Through the different levers that we talked about, they're able to control inflation to hopefully have it into a sustainable pace. Thank you very much for listening, guys. I hope that you were able to learn a little bit more about inflation, some of the implications of it, how it actually occurs, and ways to help protect yourself against inflation, and hopefully will better your future.